Here in chapter 16, we're going to wrap up this idea of neural integration. So if you'll recall, in chapter 15, we really looked at how sensory information was brought up to the brain, right, to the central nervous system. And we also looked at the somatic motor nervous system output, somatic nervous system output, which is motor output, and the effector in that case was the skeletal muscle, right? Here in chapter 16, we're going to look at our other motor output, which is the autonomic nervous system, but this time we're going to look at how its effects play out on the visceral organs. So chapter 16 is really about the autonomic nervous system, and then we kind of switch gears, maybe a little awkwardly, switch gears and talk a little bit about higher order functions in the brain. So we'll do a lot of kind of comparisons of what we looked at in chapter 15, as well as what we're looking at here in chapter 16. So just a reminder, right, as we're looking at the somatic and motor mean the same thing. The somatic nervous system, the big difference we see here is who the effector is, right? So in the somatic nervous system, that effector is the skeletal muscle, right? And we see that pretty clearly here in this image. In the autonomic nervous system, the effectors are going to be visceral effectors. So they're pointing out smooth muscle, glands, cardiac muscle, adipose. So in the autonomic nervous system, we have these so-called visceral effectors. And again, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands like sweat glands, salivary glands, and then adipose, right? Adipocytes storing those triglycerides so we can access these different fuels. Now this image is also pointing out a couple of other important features. I think this by far is the most important distinction here. A couple other things though, we'll see where this central nervous system input is coming from. On the somatic side, so maybe I'll call that like CNS, maybe origin, right? On the somatic side, those decisions are being made by the cortex. I'm already running out of room here. And if you recall, the cortex is what allows this to be part of our consciousness as we're making decisions about what to do. And here we see in the autonomic nervous system that these, kind of the highest point of decision making here is the hypothalamus. And so in the somatic nervous system, we talked about the fact that even the neurons that actually reach out and touch those effectors are part of the central nervous system. Here in the autonomic nervous system, we're going to talk a lot about what they're calling ganglia, which if you recall is a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And so here, these neurons that are actually reaching out to the effectors are in the peripheral nervous system. Now, on a day-to-day basis, that doesn't really make that much of a difference, right, as long as the message gets there. Okay, so those are a couple of big differences there. And I will say too, with the ganglia, we'll try to keep that a little less confusing maybe than what we saw in the book. They do get into a lot of detail. Okay, within the autonomic nervous system, we have two branches, right? So in the autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic nervous system, or the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, but typically we just call it the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, and then the parasympathetic division. And we've mentioned this briefly in the past. Now, a couple things to note here, and we'll talk about this more. You'll see the organs that are innervated, and you'll notice that they are the same. So most organs in the body actually have what we call dual innervation, where both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems innervate them. We'll come back to that thought. Let's make sure we're clear on our major differences here. So when we are talking about the sympathetic nervous system, right, we said this is our fight or flight response. Right, so we think about this side of the nervous system being very excitatory, preparing us for an emergency. It's a very catabolic branch of the nervous system in that it's freeing up energy reserves. So we break down glycogen, we free up fatty acids from our adipocytes in order to dump those lipids into the bloodstream to be used as fuel, right? So very catabolic. So we'll actually break things down to release that energy. Again, things like glycogen and lipids are released here. So when we think about the fight or flight response, let's start up at the very top. One of the things that we see is that this branch of the autonomic nervous system is very stimulatory even to the brain, right? It's going to increase your mental alertness. Right, it kind of puts you on edge. It actually stimulates that reticular activating system that we talked before in the brain and gets us ready to observe everything that we possibly can. It does things like dilate the pupils. That's kind of minor, but it dilates the pupils. You're bringing in more information. It does increase the metabolic rate. Right, so we were talking about releasing these energy stores, and this side of the autonomic nervous system is going to tell all of your cells to start making ATP and get ready to go. The organs that it's going to, I'll keep going this way. We do things like increase the blood flow to the skeletal muscles. Definitely we increased blood flow to the brain for this mental alertness, but if we want to carry all these fuels to the skeletal muscle, right, because if you think about fighting or fleeing, those are the organs that are really going to be stimulated. On the flip side, since we're sending all this blood flow to the skeletal muscle, the sympathetic nervous system is actually going to inhibit things like digestion, the urinary system, the reproductive. And this becomes apparent, and when I say inhibit, right, it's calming. The neurotransmitters that they'll release there are kind of calming those organs, but it's also redirecting blood flow away from these organs. Again, this one becomes maybe most obvious in exercise. It can be really difficult to digest food if you're working out really hard. So someone running a marathon is probably not eating a cheeseburger. That is gonna sit like a brick in your stomach because you're in fight or flight mode during exercise. You're not worried about digestion. And so a lot of athletes are eating like goos or drinking Gatorade to get quick absorbing materials that don't really need to be digested, right? The urinary system, we actually turn off blood flow, redirect blood flow to muscle and away from the kidney. And so for some athletes, it may be several hours after they work out that they have to pee, those sorts of things. Okay? We are going to increase the respiratory rate, right? And the sympathetic nervous system is also going to lead to bronchodilation, the opening of the airways. And again, you could think about how those could be important if you're about to fight a mountain lion or run away. I think you're supposed to fight the mountain lion, don't run. Other things that we see here, increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, right? So again, a lot of effects here on cardiac muscle, but then also the smooth muscle that's found in blood vessels. And one we don't think as much about, sorry, I've already written over it, but if you look at this image, they're showing that the sympathetic nervous system also activates sweat glands. And so you have a big list here, which you could straight up memorize. You could come up with some pattern mnemonic that you want to use, or you could think about the last time you gave a speech in front of one of your classes, right? And maybe how mentally aware you were. Maybe you started getting warm as that metabolic rate increased. Maybe you started pitting out, right? Because of those nerves, that kind of anxiety there. You may not have noticed, you might have noticed the heart rate or the blood pressure, feeling a little, you might not have noticed, say, the respiratory rate, or the fact that you weren't digesting well and those sorts of things, but maybe thinking of it that way would actually be much easier than just trying to memorize this list of what the sympathetic nervous system looks like. Now, I will say these two systems are kind of opposites of each other. So we'll run through parasympathetic nervous system, but you'll notice that it's going to be things like, oh, well, the pupils constrict and the metabolic rate decreases. It's a lot of the opposite. But let's run through there. So parasympathetic nervous system the parasympathetic nervous system then, we often call the rest and digest. System, right? So instead of fight or flight, now we're resting, we're relaxed, right? We're enjoying that cheeseburger now and digesting it. So this side of the autonomic nervous system then results in a lot of anabolic reactions, right? Because if you're digesting food and absorbing those nutrients, now you can build glycogen, you can build triglyceride stores for if you need them later to fight that mountain lion, right? Kind of interesting to me as you look at we're going to the same organs, but notice all these sympathetic nervous system neurons are actually coming out of the thoracic and lumbar region, and then parasympathetic is kind of split, right? You've got some brainstem innervation and then also nerves coming from the sacral region. I don't care that you memorize it, but it's kind of interesting as you look at this big open space here on the parasympathetic side. Right, so we'll run through our list a little quicker here. Things like decreased metabolic rate, right? Because now we're actually trying to store that energy. Decreased heart rate, blood pressure, decreased respiratory rate, bronchoconstriction, right? We just don't need to move near as much air in and out of our airways. When you have that lower metabolic rate, you don't need as much oxygen, you don't need to expel as much CO2. We see an increased secretion of digestive secretions, enzymes, so salivary glands get activated, all those stomach glands, glands in the pancreas, those sorts of things. I'm just going to say juices. Increased secretion of digestive juices, again, salivary, stomach, places like that. We'll see again in the digestive system, we see an increase in blood flow, right? Instead of shunting it away, now we're actually sending blood. And we'll also see an increase in motility. Right, so the smooth muscle starts becoming more active in the digestive system, in the stomach and the small intestines, right? And then also on this side of the autonomic nervous system, we'll also see an increased activity in the urinary system, right? So stimulation of urination. And related to the digestive system, defecation. Right? And so it really is during this period of resting and digesting that the body feels comfortable enough, at ease enough to relieve itself, to remove those wastes from the body. Right? So these are two very different systems that we see here, but they're working side by side. And again, I think it's important to understand this idea that most organs are actually innervated by both, right? And we called that dual innervation. And this is really important in understanding what we call autonomic tone. And this autonomic tone is this idea that you have innervation from both branches, and now you can kind of like turn one side up, turn the other down, kind of find that sweet spot and keep making these small adjustments in order to achieve homeostasis. So in the skeletal muscle system, we talk about muscle tone, right? That little bit of activity that's kind of constantly there so that muscle's ready to go. And here we see in the autonomic nervous system, we also have tone, right? These neurons are delivering messages all the time, and then we make slight adjustments to get the desired response. Okay, so kind of having that overview, let's look here a little more at the sympathetic nervous system. Again, I pointed out that most of the neurons are, I guess all, I will say all here, all the neurons are coming from thoracic and lumbar spinal nerves. And one of the things that we'll see here is, right, again, they're doing this in great detail to try to help you kind of review and really understand this material. Notice, since we're looking at motor output here, our neurons are located in that anterior this is actually lateral gray horn, since it's visceral output, right? And we see that autonomic neuron, that motor output, coming through that ventral root and going out to a spinal nerve. Now, a couple things they point out here, right? Remember I said ganglia become important? Right? And the ganglia or ganglion, if we're looking at singular, right? These are just clusters of cell bodies in the PNS, in the peripheral nervous system. Okay? And so what we see here, they're showing us that neuron, again, lateral gray horn, and then it's going to a ganglion where it's going to synapse with what they're calling a postganglionic neuron, and that actually goes to the effector. Now, I don't want to get too crazy here. This is one of the things that I said I will simplify. But notice where these ganglia are. So there's a group called the sympathetic chain ganglia. There's a group called collateral ganglia, which they're showing kind of just anterior to the spinal cord here. And then the adrenal medulla, or actually a modified ganglion. I'm going to go back here. When we look at this picture, notice that, right? These are all of these sympathetic chain ganglia. So kind of lateral to the spinal cord, you have these clusters of cell bodies that are going to help make decisions here for the viscera. These are the three blanking, collateral ganglia. And they've put them off to the side here so you can see them, right? But those are anterior to the spinal cord. And then finally, they're showing that this preganglionic neuron goes all the way out to the adrenal medulla, right? Again, I don't care that you memorize actually the name of those ganglia. They do end up feeding slightly different effectors, right? So again, lateral gray horns of the spinal cord, that's where the preganglionic neuron is. When they synapse, right, so picture this nerve coming out to a ganglia, right, and that ganglionic neuron or postganglionic neuron then has to go to the target organ. So preganglionic, I would actually call this one postganglionic neuron. Again, sympathetic chain ganglia, collateral ganglia, there are 3 of them, and then the adrenal medulla. Okay, but what we're going to focus in on are these effectors, right? So a reminder that these are all going to be visceral effectors. They're pointing out that this first group is really going more towards like the thoracic cavity, right? So maybe think about breathing, expanding your lungs. The collateral ganglia, again, abdominal cavity. So we see these feeding the stomach and the liver and the spleen, that kind of thing, right? And then the adrenal medulla is an interesting one because basically the adrenal medulla are going to release the hormone epinephrine into the bloodstream. So it releases epi and norepi, right? Which other names for this are adrenaline and noradrenaline. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, right? We're looking at adrenaline here, and that's actually going to be a hormone. Goes to the blood, right? So no longer communicating via a neuron, and it is going to then communicate with organs throughout the body. So what I want you to see here is when we're in the sympathetic nervous system, we actually have this really broad impact of the messages that have been decided in the hypothalamus or somewhere else here in the central nervous system. Now, another thing, see lots of comparisons, autonomic nervous system with somatic. When these neurons are talking to smooth muscle, I did want to point this out. I don't know if you noticed this when we were in the chapter on muscle, because we didn't really spend a whole lot of time on smooth muscle. In skeletal muscle, we dealt with what was called the neuromuscular junction, where you had a single neuron, right? It had an axon terminal that synapsed with a skeletal muscle, and you had an action taking place. What we see here in smooth muscle are what are called varicosities. And this is, as you see, right, here comes our neuron, and instead of a single axon terminal, you have all these kind of bulbous regions. They're very similar to axon terminals in that they have vesicles filled with neurotransmitters, in this case, norepinephrine. And so what ends up happening, right, remember skeletal muscle fibers were really long, a single cell could be really long, and these are much more individual cells. So now when we want to send a message, it's kind of neat. The neuron is now touching so many different cells through this varicosity, through these little beads, and it can release neurotransmitter to impact a lot of them at the same time. Okay? So sympathetic nervous system, very widespread results. The use of varicosities here is quite common. We do have, speaking of neurotransmitters, we have basically 2 different options. We have cholinergic synapses. This is going to use acetylcholine. That's the neurotransmitter that we've probably talked the most about, right? And acetylcholine, right, as a cholinergic synapse. You also have what are called adrenergic. See if I can spell that. Adrenergic synapse. And that's going to be what this synapse is here, using something like epi or norepi. Right, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. So I do want you to know the difference between a cholinergic synapse and an adrenergic synapse. But one of the things, and so here in the sympathetic nervous system, sorry, your key is right here, acetylcholine, epi, norepi. That synapse that takes place in the ganglion is always a cholinergic synapse. But then when we see when we're actually reaching that effector, the actual target, we tend to use more adrenergic synapses there. This one is trying to show you the adrenal medulla dumping that hormone into the bloodstream, and then kind of how widespread epi and norepi can be when it's carried through the blood. Okay, now do not go here. Right? I don't want you to memorize this table, but I would be remiss if I did not mention that when we're looking at adrenergic and cholinergic synapses, the receptor matters as well, right? So adrenergic synapses, we said use what neurotransmitter? Epi or norepi. But notice what happens here. There are 5 different receptor types. There are 3 different alpha receptors, 2 different beta. You don't have to memorize this, but I want you to understand that epi or norepi can act very differently depending on which receptor a specific target has. And I want you to recognize this because you'll end up in a pharmacology class someday and they're talking about beta blockers, right? And here we are, right? That's a very specific receptor that's found on the heart, right? And so epi and norepi, for example here, would stimulate the heart, right? That would increase the heart rate. A beta blocker, you might be looking at a drug that's trying to decrease the heart rate, right? Keep it from getting too high, kind of protect the heart. So I want you to at least recognize these terms for later use, right? And so you'll see here, right, in our alpha receptors, some let that epinephrine, norepinephrine be excitatory, right? But in other places, that's actually epi or norepi might be inhibitory, right? Maybe on some of those glands, that's part of the reason that maybe we're actually calming the digestive system during sympathetic nervous system activation. Okay. Oh, yep, same, just I pulled this picture from another book showing you how adrenaline, noradrenaline, depending on what receptor type is stimulated, you might get very different responses from the same neurotransmitter. Okay, a moment for the parasympathetic nervous system here. Okay, so same idea, looking at the parasympathetic nervous system. Here, right, we see that the preganglionic neurons are coming from the brainstem or from the sacrum, right? And then, similar idea, we see ganglia still, but this time the ganglia tend to be much closer to the organ in question. Again, doesn't make a huge difference in how it functions, but anatomically, these systems are set up a bit differently. One thing to note here, right, is, again, these cell bodies coming out of the brainstem or potentially the sacrum. The pons and the medulla, when we talked about these regions of the brain, we talked about how important they were in maintaining kind of basic life support systems, breathing rate, heart rate, etc. So it makes sense that we have a lot of innervation coming out of here. Now, since these are part of the brain, we actually see these messages traveling over cranial nerves, right? These are not coming out of spinal nerves, but instead coming off of cranial nerves. And the one I would really point out here, vagus, which is number 10, vagus, baby. The vagus nerve, look at this. Heart, lungs, liver, gallbladder, like everything down here. The vagus nerve actually carries about 75% of all the parasympathetic innervation that is going to the organs. So this is a very important nerve. And again, since this is the rest and digest side, when it innervates the heart, it's decreasing the heart rate, right? When it innervates the lungs, it's decreasing the breathing rate, those sorts of things. So it has this calming effect on these visceral organs. I would also point out that this, because, maybe there's the reason why we even bother mentioning this, because the ganglia tend to be much closer to the organ, the parasympathetic innervation can be much more detailed, right? It can be much more specific in which organs it's talking to, where sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight, was more widespread. Detailed or specific is a better way to say it. Specific organs target very specific organs here instead of being widespread. Let's see. Okay. Again, a similar figure to what we saw for the sympathetic nervous system, pointing out again that a lot of this innervation is coming through cranial nerves. There is some sacral nerve input as well. And again, looking at like how specific these activities can be on our target organs, right? So changing the size of the pupil, right here we're impacting salivary glands, right, from that particular cranial nerve. Okay? Again, in your picture here, they're trying to show you that that ganglion is much closer to the target organ, right? That post-ganglionic neuron is usually much shorter here. They're also trying to point out here that in the parasympathetic nervous system, we are always using acetylcholine. Right? So all of these synapses, we could say, are cholinergic. They're using acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter. And this time the receptors, instead of having the alpha and the beta, this time the receptors are what we call nicotinic and muscarinic. And the book points out these names really come kind of as a historical artifact of how they were studied. But what we'll find is in a nicotinic receptor, that acetylcholine is excitatory, right? It's going to put that next cell into some kind of activity or put it closer to threshold, that sort of thing. And that muscarinic receptors, it actually can be either excitatory or inhibitory. Okay. So again, not to get into too much detail on that, but those are terms that you will hear again, and so I want to make sure that you've at least come across them before. Okay. So here's a picture I pulled from another source, again, emphasizing this idea that the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, right? Overarching that is the fact that we are in the autonomic nervous system, right? We are having an effect on these visceral organs, and that most of these organs are in fact innervated by both branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And we talked about it from the get-go, right? These two branches are going to have very different impacts on these organs. But it's kind of interesting, this dual innervation. So when you get to the cardiac chapter in AMP2, we'll talk about the fact that the cardiac muscle is actually autorhythmic, right? It sets up its own heartbeat. That's what the pacemaker, right, the SA node in the heart is for. And if left to its own devices, your heart would beat like 100 times a minute, way more than it has to, and frankly would wear out a lot quicker. And so what you have happening is all the time, the parasympathetic nervous system is just like, chill out, it's all good, calm down, right? And that's trying to bring your heart rate down towards, we would consider 60 beats per minute normal, right? But given a fight or flight situation, we stop telling the heart to chill out. In fact, the sympathetic nervous system is going to stimulate that heart muscle to beat even faster, right? So, and that's an interesting example because the heart does not need innervation. It is autorhythmic. It will beat on its own, but we can see how this autonomic tone, right, turning one up, turning one down, is actually going to help us maintain homeostasis. And that's the part that I think is really quite fascinating here, right? That's another, yeah, again, like if you're eating and you want the digestive tract to be active, you turn down sympathetic input, you turn up parasympathetic input, right? So those organs kind of get activated. But then when you go for a workout, you go ahead and turn this down, you turn this back up, kind of shutting off those organs. So autonomic tone. Okay, the other, this is one of the last things about autonomic nervous system is that you do still have reflexes, right? We definitely tend to think of reflexes as a somatic nervous system thing, right? That the muscle contracts, skeletal muscle contracts in response to something. We have reflexes here in the autonomic nervous system as well. And it's kind of interesting. You kind of have to nerd out on this to think this is interesting. But notice they're showing you long reflexes and short reflexes. In long reflexes, we have sensory input that's actually coming to the CNS, right, the spinal cord, and that quick response out. Now, instead of going to skeletal muscle, we'll go through a ganglion, right, and out to that effector, that gland, the cardiac muscle, whatever. Okay? Notice that a short reflex doesn't even use the central nervous system. That sensory input comes to a ganglion, and just in the peripheral nervous system, we can make a decision. So typically what you'll see are these longer reflexes are going to have an effect maybe on like a whole organ, where these short reflexes, we use this a lot, say in the digestive tract, and you're making kind of these minute changes along that organ in specific spots. Anyway, okay, so then this figure, 16.8, is giving you a summary of really all the neural integration that we've talked about, right? So we know sensory input is coming up here, right? We talked last week about those somatic reflexes, right? The effector being skeletal muscle. And just now we were talking about these visceral reflexes, both short and long, right? So this is all peripheral nervous system, central nervous system. That sensory input can go beyond just those things that are reflexive in nature, right? And actually get to these processing centers in the brainstem, right? We then start to see a split. If the sensory information is coming from the viscera, we tend to see the hypothalamus receiving that input, because remember, the hypothalamus is kind of running the autonomic nervous system and making the changes at those visceral effectors. If that information is more important on the skeletal muscle side of the things, the somatic side of things, we send that up through the thalamus, right, where it's kind of filtered, and the information that actually makes it to the cerebral cortex, then we can make voluntary decisions using that skeletal muscle. So a pretty nice overview of what we've been talking about in these last two chapters. And so really, oh, there's some reflexes for you. Really, what we have left are higher order thinking. And the big one that we look at here, right, because when they talk about this idea of higher order thinking in chapter 16, this is the super complicated stuff that's taking place in your cerebral cortex. Language, art, intelligence, math, memory. And the big one they focus in here on memory is memory. And I don't think this was an accident. I think your authors were saying, hey, you know what's super important in anatomy class, or for people that are interested in this information because they want to go on and be a nurse or a doctor or a physical therapist or occupational therapist, right? Any of those kind of jobs. Memory becomes super important. You have to fit so much of this new language, this new information in your brain. And so they make a couple important points here, and they kind of chose this, I think, as their area of higher order thinking to focus on. So notice what they're showing you here. Short-term memory versus long-term memory, right? Short-term memory would be like if I told you, hey, remember cat, the number 7, and the color blue. I'm going to ask you those again in a few minutes. So cat, the number 7, and the color blue. Keep that in mind, right? That short-term memory, basically what happens is over like the short term, right, minutes, hours, you can recall those things, right? They're held kind of superficially in the brain, and that might be fine for something like that. But in order for something to make it into your long-term memory, you have to do this process called consolidation. And typically, this is areas like the hippocampus and the amygdala we talked about before. Are involved in this process of consolidation. But I will say one of the most important things from moving memory from short term to long term is repetition. Right? If you wanted to stick around, right, is repetition. And that's very important to understand for studying. Other things that might help, right? We talked a little bit about these regions of the brain also being involved in things like fear or emotions. And there have been studies that show those things that you have an emotional response to, you're much more likely to remember, right? So a lot of us remember where we were when we heard, that terrible news, right? Or maybe something you learned if you were an EMT, like on the site of an accident and you dealt with a certain situation, you are much more likely to hold on to that memory, right? It goes through consolidation and really gets kind of drilled in there better, right? So you might think about how some of these things could be useful in your studying. In fact, your book tries to give you these little stories, these little vignettes, so that you care about that patient, right? And maybe you'll actually think about or remember their condition later on. I don't even know if students read those vignettes, right? But definitely you need repetition to add things to long-term memory. I should say another part of consolidation, sorry, I'm gonna pretend you're adding that to this list over here that I just erased. Sleep. Sleep is really important in this conversion from short-term to long-term memory. So there actually, there's a cool, I think I was hearing it on NPR, they were talking about this idea that, if you're learning guitar, right, and you're trying to play this specific section of a song and you mess it up, and you try again, and you mess it up, and you try, so you're practicing, but man, you are not succeeding. It's really complicated. You can't quite get it. If you go to sleep, when you wake up the next day, it is quite possible that you play it perfectly. That while you were sleeping, your brain created these connections that made it possible for you to then play that song. Now, long-term memory, there's secondary memory. This is stuff you hold on to quite a bit longer. They talk about tertiary memories as things that are going to be with you throughout your life. Maybe the smell of your grandmother's house, right? Or what your birthday is, or those sorts of things. Okay. The other thing that I'll point out is this: what's really physically happening as you're making these memories. And this is interesting because they even make the point that we don't really understand how we access memories, right? Where they are. But a couple things we do know is that physically, Part of this consolidation is actually the number of synapses. So the more repetition you have, right, on a certain, right, if you're working with fact memory, right, on certain topics and things like that, the more synapses you create. You also increase the amount of neurotransmitter that's being released. So you're actually kind of constantly putting those cells closer to threshold, making it a little bit easier to access these memories, right? And I had one more. Oh, I kind of tied those together. This neurotransmitter, they were calling it facilitation, but increased neurotransmitter release, and then they call it facilitation to describe that idea of being closer to threshold. We also know that these memories seem to be held in the cerebral cortex, and they're in that region that they're associated with. So it's quite complicated, right? If you think about, like, you know what a cow looks like, right? So that's going to be in one part of the brain, right? But we talked about that idea that when you see this written on the board, you understand what that means, right? So these visual association areas, and then maybe you're tying that together, your book did the whole thing, right? Maybe you're tying that together with the sound a cow makes, right? That's in an auditory region. And so this really does get quite complicated, okay? But again, if you're trying to put something into long-term memory, repetition, sleep, emotion, those sorts of things make these memories stronger. Okay, the last thing I'll say about memory then, they also point out that there is a difference between fact memory and skill memory, right? So in this class, we're really flexing muscles on this fact memory, but there's plenty of things that you already know, like your name would be a fact. But then there's also skill memory, right? You know how to open a jar. If I hand you a jar, you know exactly what to do with that, right? It's not like each jar becomes a different puzzle. The other thing that would fit under skill memory, some of us like things like skiing or snowboarding, right? As you practice that, as you repeat those movements, you're actually creating memories that tell your body how to do really complicated physical skills, right? And so realizing that those are two different kinds of memory as well. Okay, there is so much more, obviously, on the brain and higher order thinking. I'm hoping that maybe in some of your psychology classes or human growth and development, you get a little more in there. That's as far as we're gonna go. Our last chapter coming up next is the special senses, and that's the last chapter that we really have on the nervous system.